You're listening to the Color Country Podcast, your passport to the breathtaking public lands and tourism destinations nestled in southern Utah and northern Arizona. Join host Stephanie DeGraw and her guests.
Hi, and welcome to the Color Country Podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie DeGraw. Today, we're talking with Dr. William Mader, who is going to be talking about the Red Cliffs Desert Reserve and the proposed Northern Corridor Highway that could run through the Red Cliffs. Dr. Mader, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Oh, entirely my pleasure. Thanks for the kind invitation.
Yes, and thank you for letting me call you Bill. That'll make it a little easier. You've got a very unique background to be talking about this subject. You were the first administrator of Red Cliffs, and you were a senior scientist at Lockheed. So maybe fill in some of that background for me, and then we'll jump into the topic at hand.
Sure. I have a checkered past, but I'm proud of the fact there's no jail time in Washington County. I had the opportunity to do lots of things. My last chapter was teaching as an associate professor at Navajo Tech University on the Navajo Reservation, which was probably the most fulfilling job I've ever had. I really enjoyed being around students and young people and interacting and seeing also firsthand where federal agreements worked and where they often did not work. So that gives another prism to examine the proposed Northern Corridor as well.
Yes. You were the director in the very beginning, so you do have the unique perspective of seeing what was going on firsthand. Back, I think you mentioned it was 1995. You submitted to the federal agencies. Let's start from that beginning of the Red Cliffs Reserve.
Sure. It was about 30 years ago, and a great many people worked on it and brought it to fruition. I co-authored, along with other people, the original Habitat Conservation Plan. I was on the recreation committee that was put together where we examined where we should put trails and trailheads. I wore out shoes attending public meetings to help sell this. Myself and other people went to Washington, D.C., where we met with the Assistant Secretary of the Interior to help get this going. So it was a long time ago, but I haven't aged at all. I want to assure everybody.
None of us have, right?
But great things really did happen back then. The big push, there was kind of a paralysis, actually, that forced the push, and that is development is often the lifeblood of any city, good or bad it is. And it was frozen at that time about 30 years ago because the desert tortoise was listed as threatened, justifiably listed as threatened, I might add. Uh-huh. And so that halted things until we could get an agreement with Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM, the state, and other parties. We got that. Again, a great many people made it happen. The deal was fundamentally simple. Tortoise habitat outside the reserve, Red Cliffs Desert Reserve, now NCA, it could be developed. We would remove as many tortoises as we could through a partnership with the state, and that habitat would be destroyed. But in return, the mitigation for that destruction was setting up the reserve and protecting it. And we recognized back then that there would have to be allowance for traffic from east to west. And so when we wrote up the plan, we put widening and realignment for Skyline Drive or Red Hills Parkway in there. That removed, I think, over a dozen acres of critical habitat inside the reserve, but that was part of the deal. We stood by the deal. We removed tortoises from there. And many of us have driven across that road now. So the highway was addressed. I think what people need to understand is that the Northern Corridor Highway through the reserve was never promised, period, end of story. People that are saying that don't recognize the facts, and they were not there. It did not happen. The great thing about the reserve is that it's not just about tortoises. It was about saving biodiversity, about recreational trails, letting people use it, horseback riders, hikers, saving some of the history there, all the way from dinosaur tracks to pioneer sites to Indian cultural sites. It was about everything, saving everything and putting it aside for future generations. And the Northern Corridor Highway will destroy that.
Yes. And I think that's really a good point, is that sometimes people get fixated on the tortoise, but yet there's so many other things in that area that are worth saving. And I think this is a good point for us to talk about before we talk about fire lines. And let's talk about some of the other options we have for our traffic situation.
There are a couple proposed inside the reserve. None of those are acceptable scientifically and by prior agreement because none of them were promised. The ones that make the most sense are those outside the reserve. For me personally, the one that catches my attention was one discussed about 22 years ago. And that was an expressway over the industrial park, a flyover, if you want to use that term. And flyover freeways are very common if you've traveled in big cities. It could have been addressed over 20 years ago to resolve traffic issues. It was not. That still makes a lot of sense, doing the flyover over the industrial park from I-15 into Road Hills Parkway and properly planning it. But from my perspective, the input I get, that's still a very viable, defendable option, and it doesn't impact or violate the reserve. And another point to remember is that the team spent over $20 million of land and conservation monies to acquire parcels, private property inside the reserve. We spent over $20 million. It was to preserve habitat and conservation. It was never to be used to lay pavement for a freeway at a later date.
Yes, and it kind of surprises me that this is even an issue, because in my mind, if we're trying to preserve an area, why would we then go ahead and build a freeway through it when there's other alternatives? So I do think it's important for people to research and look at all the alternatives before they just jump on the bandwagon for just one alternative.
Yeah, another thing worth remembering is that the reserve, like many places in the world, and I've been to some of those, but the reserve is what I would call an Alamo habitat. It's a habitat barely hanging on. It's fighting for its life. It's at a tipping point of collapse. And we could not let that happen. Northern Corridor Highway through the reserve will tip it over. Stephanie, it would be like removing one or two major arteries from your heart and then wishing you good luck. It's not going to work.
Some of the concerns that other people have mentioned too, if this proposed highway goes through that area, is that the area would then become more susceptible to fires. Can you talk about that?
It will become more susceptible. Approximately 30% or more of the reserve has already burned. Some of those by apparently human-caused fires. And to me, this is not a theoretical discussion over a coffee table with a cold drink. To get through college many years ago, this would have been in the 1970s. I was on helitack crews and later as a smoke jumper parachuting in the fire. So I get it. I know what's involved. I appreciate all the hard work firefighters are doing now across the West in Canada and Alaska. As odd as it sounds, a quick digression, but there's a point here. I made 3 parachute jumps into the Arctic Circle on fires. It was burning even then.
Even up there. Oh my gosh.
There. And it's burning. It's also burning now. And in fairness, I never imagined that entire cities and ecosystems would burn to the ground. And now we've seen that with Paradise, California, over 85 people killed. If you've seen the photographs, they're devastating photographs. Then Lahaina and Maui a couple years ago, 100 people killed. The people that survived, some of them were able to make it to the ocean. And I've been through that part of Maui a couple of times. And frankly, I never thought it would burn down.
Wow.
And you're looking at what happened recently in New Mexico and Rio Doso. I was on a fire there in 73 or 74. Look at California now. Look at Utah. I can see smoke
Uh-huh.
Well, that's the new real world. Mega fires are here to stay. So people that live adjacent to the reserve in Green Springs and Washington City, they have very valid concerns because the fire beast is very unpredictable. And I would feel the same way they did. I would not want a freeway or any other mechanism that could possibly introduce fires.
Right. And then let's also point out the fact that some people are saying, oh, but a freeway could become a fire break. And that's not necessarily true.
It's not true. In fact, I think it's just political spin. I've seen fires jump canyons and all kinds of things. It will not be an effective fire break. And all you have to do is just look around, see the reports on the news about fires jumping over cities. And
right. We can't really control the wind. So
you cannot control the wind. You can't control the slope. You can't control the humidity and temperatures. And they blow up, I'm here to tell you.
So let's talk now about where we're at with this issue as far as we've had the public comment that wrapped up recently. And now what are the next steps going forward?
My understanding, I'm not an expert on it, is that BLM will address the decision. I've been told, thousands of comments. I think it's good to give the public comment on it and talk to people who will be impacted. Yes, and BLM has changed it a couple of times, so I can't project when it will be resolved or if there will be further litigation back and forth. The unfortunate thing about it, as I pointed out earlier, is that this wouldn't be happening had the real solution, the flyover, the expressway from I-15 to Red Hills Parkway, been completed over 20 years ago. We wouldn't be having this conversation. But I think the city and the county wanted to make a statement. And in my view, it's a statement about we control public lands. We're going to decide. I think that's one of the big hearts of the issue, is that there was a recent article in Salt Lake Tribune where something like 30% of the politicians benefit from development. There's a financial side to building that freeway that would make some parties wealthy and well off. I think part of the drive, but the reserve is public property. It belongs to every citizen in the United States.
Exactly. And I think even though the BLM may be finished taking comments from what I read recently, I think it's important that we as citizens reach out to our elected leaders and keep on them about what we want to have happen. It's ironic because really this area pushes that we are a great area, outdoor recreation and tourism and our beautiful scenery. And we need to let our officials, if we feel so, that this is something that should not happen. And yes, we definitely have growth down here in southern Utah. And I've lived here before, and so it's pretty dramatic from my perspective. But there's ways we can manage our growth without sacrificing the very special thing that we have here, which is our outdoors. What else can we mention about this subject?
I would mention a couple other things, is that the reserve was also put there for wildlife and people. Let's don't forget people who use it. And I've walked over much of it, also flown over much of it as well. And there are many clinical studies to indicate that when people go out with nature, they benefit mentally. It's good for your health. It makes you feel good. So this would be like destroying our drugstore down the street. It's good for you. It's good for the population. It's, as you pointed out, why people came here. Many people came here. And there's something else, if you step back and look at the big picture worldwide, over 50% of our pharmaceuticals come from plants, in addition to others that come from animals. For example, some people may be surprised to know that the Gila monster, which is inside the reserve, threatened in my view, that's been tied to at least two drugs that benefit people. One is the weight loss drug Ozempic. The biochemistry for that drug has come from Gila monsters, because Gila monsters have a compound that regulates hunger. Isn't that interesting?
That's amazing, yes.
And also Gila monster biochemistry has been used to treat type 2 diabetes. Animals here and on the other side of the world are good for you. You need them. You can look at crocodiles in Asia, perhaps even South America. I remember walking through lots of lagoons with crocodiles and piranha down there. Crocodiles are very resistant to fatal fungal diseases and infection. Now they're being studied, their biochemistry, to fight fungal infections in humans. Similarly, the Bothrops viper in South America, and I've seen a couple of those too. You never want to get bit by a Bothrops.
No.
They kill their prey by, among other things, drastically dropping the blood pressure, and you pass out. So now there's a drug out there being used to treat hypertension in people from a poisonous viper in South America. So the take-home message here is that nature, in ways yet to be even discovered, is really good for you, not just mentally, but it's good for you by way of pharmaceutical drugs.
Yes, so much to think about as this area struggles to manage its growth and still somehow balance our outdoors and wildlife. Bill, I really appreciate you taking the time today to share your thoughts about the Red Cliffs Reserve and the proposed Northern Corridor Highway. You've been listening to the Color Country Podcast. Thanks for joining us. I'm Stephanie DeGraw.
You've been listening to the Color Country Podcast. Enjoy your public lands and remember to leave no trace.